Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Thinking of Adding a Q-Switch Laser to Your Practice with Dr. David Vasily. What I'd like to do right in the beginning is launch a quick poll. I just want to see how many people out there are actually using Q-Switch lasers. So if you could just select the things that you're doing, that would be fantastic. Okay, we've got most of the people voted, so let's go ahead, close that. So the results of the poll, about 47% of everybody who's using a Q-Switch laser tonight is treating pigmented and vascular conditions, while 29% are doing non-ablative skin resurfacing. 35%, a little over a third, are doing acne issues, while about 3/4 are doing tattoos, and almost 50% of tonight's attendees are actually treating melasma. It's good to know for Dr. Vasily, so he can talk more about each individual product or each individual application. So let me go ahead. I'm going to introduce Dr. Vasily now. Dr. Vasily is a board-certified dermatologist. He's certified by the American Board of Dermatology, the American Academy of Dermatology, where he's a fellow. He's the founder and president of Lehigh Valley Dermatology Associates since its inception about 30 years ago. He also founded Aesthetica Cosmetic and Laser Surgery Center, which is one of the leading clinical research centers in the country. Without anything further, let me hand it over to Dr. Vasily.
Thank you, Brian. And I appreciate very much being invited to speak on this topic. We're doing the webinar via GoToMeeting. So since we're at a meeting, I'll introduce myself as, my name is David Vasily, and I am a laser addict. And you've heard that intro before, but it really is true. I really love these devices and love speaking about them. And I think of all the devices I use, without question, one of my favorites, I think for all of us to use, are Q-switched lasers. They're just enjoyable to use. I appreciate all of you coming out tonight to listen to this talk, because there's still interest in Q-switch lasers despite the fact that we've had them in our therapeutic armamentarium for so many years. Now, I know there are varying levels of education in terms of Q-switch laser physics, and I don't want to belabor the point, but just to review a few very fascinating facts before we actually start the slides. You know, Q-switching, or quality switching, sometimes known as giant pulse formation, is really a technique by which a laser can be made to produce a pulsed output beam. What's fascinating to me is that we are still talking about Q-switch lasers and laser physics on devices that have been around really for quite some time. In fact, Q-switching was first proposed in 1958 in theory by Gordon Gould, and then discovered and demonstrated in either 61 or 62 by Hellwarth and McClung at Hughes Aircraft. And Hellwarth and McClung used switched Kerr cells, shutters, and a ruby laser to demonstrate the high peak powers attainable with Q-switched lasers. The next demonstration of significance to dermatologists and cosmetic laser surgeons is in the early 1960s, about 1962 or thereabout. Leon Goldman, the father of laser dermatology, first used a QS ruby of about 25 to 40 nanosecond pulse to treat tattoos. And then in 1964, Joseph Juice at Bell Labs really demonstrated the Q-switch ND YAG for the first time. We know that Q-switch lasers work by the same mechanism, whether they are alexandrite, ruby, or doped Nd:YAG crystals, and that is by creating a giant pulse coming out of a resonator. The resonators are solid state, or they are cavities that contain solid state media. They are optically pumped by various mechanisms and contain what are called variable attenuators. These attenuators allow the Q switch mechanism, whatever it may be, either passive or active, to go from a very low Q factor to a high Q factor. And when the gain medium, be it again ruby, alexandrite, or Nd:YAG, has reached the saturation point, it releases a very rapid pulse of laser energy in the nanosecond domain, which, as you know, is 10 to the minus ninth, or 1/1000th of a second. The light can travel 1 foot in 1 second. And so this huge gigawatt pulse is produced out of the laser resonator. There's some very interesting facts when you talk about this amount of energy. For example, if you look at a slightly shorter pulse, a femtosecond pulse coming out of a mode lock laser, the peak power of that device is equivalent to that of 100 large nuclear stations. So this is a really remarkable feat to see. Steph, I just, can we, somehow the slides are, we lost control of the slides here, and I have just a little technical glitch. I'm seeing the intro to the webinar and not the slides. There we go. Okay, sorry folks. So if we go to the first slide, yeah, this is very interesting data and shows that, you know, the worldwide procedure volume projected to 2016, I think this is fairly reasonable. If you look at the red highlighted area, we see that there's projected to be a 6.3% increase in the treatment of pigmented lesions and tattoo treatments, and we'll show you the reasons for that. Well, now, the slide shows a 4.3% increase in skin rejuvenation procedures. I would bet that that figure, in fact, will be quite higher, especially with a laser like this, a Q-switch laser that is so very effective at skin rejuvenation. All right, now let me go back one, sorry. So this slide shows that not only are the percentage of these procedures increasing, but the dollar amount spent has increased. So the fees have actually risen, which I find to be very, very interesting. And that certainly is always an issue for, as you folks know, who treat tattoos, tattoo patients. But I think you'll see in my clinical slides that are forthcoming, the number of treatments with this laser are certainly seem to be less than many other previous era Q-switch YAG. So again, big focus on pigmented lesions, tattoo treatments, and again, skin rejuvenation. And I think we will see the dollar percentage increase in that field also. This is very interesting data. The tattoo market in the US, as you folks know, is immense. In North America, there are more than 50 million people are believed to have at least one tattoo, and the worldwide figure may be 3 to 4 times greater. The Harris poll in the US, 16% of all adults in the US have at least one tattoo. Those living in the Western US are more likely to have tattoos, interesting, and males and females equally, and of course that's a reversal of what we knew from years ago. Half of the patients who have them regret them. I think it's actually higher than that in my own experience, but at least half admit to regretting them. And it's created a large and growing population of potential patients for tattoo removal in our practices. There are a lot of challenges that still remain. You know, when I started using lasers a long time ago, when there was only one laser on the marketplace, an argon, we thought, gee, in 20 years, we'll have this whole thing figured out and treated, and we'll have an answer for all of these challenges. But they remain challenges today. How to better treat tattoos, how to, in fact, treat melasma and clear it. We don't even know truly what the etiology is yet, although we're getting closer. PIH, or post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation, lentiginous freckles, SEBKs, nevus, cafe au lait, etc. And our alternatives, as you know, who are the folks who are dermatologists, are not very good. Bleaching creams are not very effective. IPLs often result in photoflaring. Various lasers, and they're listed as that because they've had various effects, none of them very good, and other treatments. I love this slide, and I think you've all probably seen variations of it, but I think this is one of the nicest examples of showing the depth of penetration of different devices. Here you see the optical window, so to speak, for the Nd:YAG because of the minimal absorption or lessened absorption by the predominant chromophores of water, melanin, and hemoglobin. So you see this very nice depth of penetration. If you've looked at biopsies of tattoo pigments, you know that they go all the way down to the deep reticular dermis and, in fact, sub-Q. So you need a device that will penetrate to this depth, and you need a device that has adequate power with a large spot size, because if you need to get enough energy with small spots, side scatter will make the device very less efficient. Here you see alexandrite, not as deep, ruby, and of course KTP down into the dermis. So we have a laser here with all capabilities, as we'll show as we go on. The next slide is critical, and it shows the mechanism of action of Q-switch lasers. The laser pulse hitting these particles and creating a photoacoustic effect, an explosion of the particles into fine dust. Now, when these particles leave the targeted particle or chromophore ink, they are leaving at supersonic speed. And so there's a lot of action going on. This is why you see steam created in the epidermis and why we wait for that steam to clear. We use the R20 technique, or we use optical clearing agents to get rid of some of the effects of supersonic photoacoustic pulsing of the target particles. The particles are then engulfed by tissue macrophages and taken to lymphatics. This is, of course, one of the reasons why removing tattoos from the distal extremities, such as the ankle, is extraordinarily difficult. So why are we looking at the Lutronic spectra? There are a ton of Q-switch YAGs. In fact, I just saw a blog on one of the laser groups on LinkedIn all about Q-switch lasers. What's the best one? Well, the best one is the one that you like and you've had great success with. And the key in this economy, versatility. That is absolutely the key feature of Lutronic spectra, and that's why we're talking about it and what you'll hopefully walk away from this webinar with after this evening's presentation. So the laser medium is a Nd:YAG solid medium. Wavelengths 1064, 532 KTP, and then you have options of 585 and 650 dye-impregnated handpieces. This is critical. This laser truly has, as we will show you, a uniform top hat beam profile. I'll explain why that's important as we go on. Many lasers claim to have it. Lutronic has shown the beam profiling beautifully in three-dimensional example. Pulse energy, here's the whole evening right here. The pulse energy is critical when you are looking at Q-switch lasers, and if you're looking at a bunch of Q-switch lasers for your practice or considering them, ask for the data on pulse energy and peak power. They go together. Now, this is essential. Pulse width, 5 to 10 nanoseconds in the Q-switch mode, and then the Lutronic spectra also contains the 300 microsecond quasi-long pulse mode with many other applications. But remember what we're talking about in this pulse duration as we go on. 8 millimeter spot, auto detection available in the collimated zoom handpiece that we'll show you, and a lot of different hertz so that you can use it for different applications and whatever hertz you're comfortable with for that procedure. If we go to the next slide, these are the two critical physics points to understand with QS lasers. If we look at the pulse width, 5, here we see pulse width from 0 to 20 nanoseconds. That's called pulse drift. If you take a QS laser, most of the QS YAGs, and you fire them repetitively for 100, 200 pulses, you can almost hear an auditory perception that that pulse is lengthening. Now, look what happens when the pulse lengthens. The peak power, which is the critical point, the highest power throughout the pulse energy train, the optical pulse energy, it drops significantly. So what you have are variations in peak power as the pulses lengthen with repetitive firing. So if you're treating a large tattoo in the back at 10 hertz, you're going to get significant variation in tissue impact, irregular results, difficult to explain results, and the risk of textural changes. Look at SPECTRA's pulse duration, 0 to 5 nanoseconds consistently, and look what happens as a result of that. The peak power is enormous. Now that is critical because when you're hitting your chromophore target at exactly the right peak power with a large spot, you're creating very confinement to the laser target. You don't lose thermal confinement and create collateral damage in the form of PIH or melasma or post-inflammatory pigment. So if we go to the next slide, this is not just a fantasy that Lutronic has created. It's been measured, and there are very sophisticated ways in the lab to actually measure pulse duration with pyroelectric devices and very sophisticated devices. And here you see, after repetitive firing, that pulse duration does not drift. That is absolutely critical. And there's a reason for that from an engineering point of view. When you're using dual resonators, you don't get oscillation in the resonating chamber, and you don't lose that pulse duration. I think this is, for all the laser geeks in the audience, which I'm sure we have a lot tonight, this is just beautiful. This three-dimensional picture is absolutely amazing to see this pulse duration. Here we see company X. We won't mention the company, but this is a company that has a laser with a lot of Gaussian hotspots. Not good. If you try, for example, a new modified R20 or R20 technique with a Q-switch JAG laser that emits a Gaussian beam, you are going to have textural changes, guaranteed. This is really where you need this beautiful example of a flat top beam. Uniform energy distribution, this reduces the likelihood of epidermal damage, blistering, side effects, and most importantly, hypopigmentation, which we've all seen. The next slide. Okay, so what we have also is this beautiful collimated zoom handpiece, and you literally can just zoom along and keep the handpiece off the target, move very quickly as rapidly as 10 hertz, and it is collimated up to about 2.5, 3 centimeters off the skin. So very nice handpiece to use. There are multiple treatment modes, as we mentioned, not just the Q-switch light. This is multiple lasers in the same box. We have a Q-switch laser with a 5 to 10 nanosecond short pulse for photoacoustic reactions, as we talked about. And then we have the so-called SPECTRA mode, which is a quasi-long pulse, 300 microsecond, 1064 pulse, which creates a photothermal effect. And we'll show you how we utilize that added feature to this laser. This is the beauty of Lutronic lasers, not just their spectra. Their spectra is just, the screen is amazingly intuitive. The ergonomics are just phenomenal. It's light as a feather. The ballast is great. All of those things that we talk about, the arm, the mirror alignment, everything is engineered just beautifully. But this is the key, this intuitive, interactive screen. This is what characterizes and typifies all of the Lutronic devices. For example, the fractional ECO2 is just, it's my iPad laser to use. And that carries through that theme on all of their lasers, including the new diode hair removal laser. So here you see this adjustable handpiece, huge safety feature. Once you dial in by a turn and lock in, and remember that lock in, that's critical, your spot size right here, it automatically appears in the window. Now that is critical because if you've ever used a Q-switch laser and you're tired and you make a mistake and you have the handpiece set one way and here the other, you hear an explosion. You hear a photoacoustic explosion sound waves because you just drilled a hole in somebody with a smaller spot size and enormous energy. So everything, it shows you the mode that you're in, 1064, 532, or the SPECTRA mode. The safety features are incredible. It's laid out very intuitively. Just fun laser to use. That's why I really love this Lutronic device. Handpieces, of course, there's a 1064, 532, and these are the so-called dye-impregnated handpieces that we mentioned in many applications. Tats, pigment melasma, PIH, acne scars, acne, nevus of Oda, and lentiginous. So this is a laser for many clinical applications. I like to think of it as a laser center in a box, in one box. I mean, you can, if you have this in your laser center, you're pretty far along. Now this is big. This is new news that just happened in late February. SPECTRA was just cleared for the treatment of melasma. And when the session's done, if any of you have a cure for melasma, let me know. As you all know, just having a treatment for melasma is huge, let alone a cure. And I can tell you from using it for melasma, it's been very nice. I'll just show you some cases from my laser center. I utilize this laser extensively to treat scars, excuse me, especially red hypertrophic scars, tats, acne and acne scars, skin rejuvenations, and other things that I can't talk about tonight because they're ongoing studies and research. Patient number 1, red hypertrophic scar post arthroscopic surgery in her knee. 3 biweekly sections with the quasi-long pulse spectral laser, and there are my parameters, 11 joules. Some of the earlier studies with quasi-long pulses showed higher fluences. You do not need that with the SPECTRA because of the remarkable flat top beam that we talked about. Now, here you see this scar, and what's interesting is the suture marks are now significantly less visible, and as you know, they're very tough to get rid of. You notice that the scar is flattened. Nicely, the patient was thrilled. It's much less red. It's still somewhat red, but significantly better, less elevation, smoother. What I now do is after lasing the scar, I let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes and then inject intralesional steroid, because what you'll find from swelling those interlocked, horizontally interlocked collagen scar fibers, you'll be able to flow the Kenalog or triamcinolone very nicely into the scar, maybe 5 milligrams per cc. You don't need 10, so you don't get any perilesional atrophy. And then take your thumb and squash it into the scar afterwards, because it's now very soft after being lased. Tremendous results, just phenomenal results on scars. So great laser for scars. Tattoos, of course, we know. Here's a 17-year-old professionally applied tattoo on a back. Tough to remove. Supposedly the latest studies show smoking and age of the tattoo makes it tough. Well, let's show you that's really not that tough. Treatment number 1, you see there, and then we did number 3, we did a modified R20 technique. And not bad for 2 treatments on a 17-year-old black ink tattoo. Notice, importantly, there are no textural changes here. There are no pigmentary changes. Perfect, normal skin, perfectly normal skin. That's the goal of tattoo removal. Okay, let's see. So here's another tattoo, professionally applied on the right arm. It's an old tattoo. You can see we did this modified sort of R20 where you do pass 1. What I do is I do 2 passes because it's been shown that that pretty much maxes the effects. Then I'll do a second pass with a little more juice because the target is a little less. We also cleaned up some colors with 532. And then here you see a similar treatment. So just to show you what you can do with after 3 sessions on a really tough tattoo, an old tattoo. The black ink is smoked and very visible. You'd have to take my word for it. It doesn't show that well, but this orange yellow color in here, yellows, oranges, much better with 532. Green, we've gotten a color change from more of a green to this blue shading, which I will now treat with the 585 handpiece. I think all of you have seen this green color change. So very, very nice. I used the Q-Switch Ruby on this till now because I got the dye-impregnated handpieces more recently, but they've just been a dream to work with. They're very, very nice. Again, patient 4 tattoo, just a little initial setting to break up the ink, fragment it, get things going, make it into finer dust, and then a couple modified R20s, and we'll show you what we got. Most of you will attest to the fact that treating tattoos on fingers or toes or nuchal areas extraordinarily difficult. This was a heavily inked tattoo to the point where these tattoos almost look plasticized, and they're oftentimes accompanying fibrosis and clinical scarring because of the needling used to put them in. But I think this is a really nice result for just 3 treatments, and the young woman is thrilled to be getting rid of Bryant. Acne. I'm sure all of you can treat acne and have great success with it. I've been a dermatologist for nearly 40 years now, and I still struggle to treat acne. It's just an incredible challenge, as are the patients. But we've found some relief with the SPECTRA treatments for acne, and there have been publications in peer-reviewed journals to show this. We'll just show you some examples of this 2 treatment session. First, treated with the photothermal effect from SPECTRA mode, and then the Q switch mode. So we get both a photothermal and photoacoustic effect on sebaceous glands. So very difficult. This is a patient who's failed 2 courses of Accutane, all antibiotics, all topicals, very discouraged, down. You can see some red atrophic scars and active inflammatory papules and comedones. And here he is after 4 treatments. Notice the improvement, the textural change improvement, which I think is really remarkable in this cluster of scars. He was very, very happy at this point, much better psychologically too. And you see the same thing here, a lot of pitted red atrophic scars over the whole cheek, substantial improvement after 4 treatment sessions. Very, very nice results. Another acne patient, he had been treated with other acne devices with some results, and then we got the SPECTRA in and did the SPECTRA peels for the acne, and again, nice results. Now, this is to show that you can use it in combo with pulsed dye laser or other lasers also. You can be very creative with this laser and mix and blend and stack. But some nice results here where he has some early pitted scarring, larger pores, and this, he has very soft skin, which, as you folks know, pits and scars very easily. So very nice improvement in scarring and active acne. Skin rejuvenation, it is probably my favorite treatment to have done on my own skin. Just incredible results with these so-called SPECTRA peels. And if you Google in SPECTRA peels, and I encourage you folks to do that, look at the patient comments on the blogs from all over the world, especially Asia. It's an extraordinarily popular procedure with very high patient approval rating. So wrinkling of the orbital areas, blotchy redness, pores, oily skin. Patients don't want downtime and they don't want pain. So we did a monthly SPECTRA laser peels using the quasi-long pulse mode first for a photothermal effect on sebaceous glands and pores and fine lines, and then this mode. And this photothermal mode, folks, is real. We actually, on the molecular basis, know that it regulates interleukin-8, transforming growth factor beta. A lot of things happening with collagen synthesis with this mode. And the Q switch mode creates a photomechanical injury and probably some HSP protein elevation, which is also is seen with the SPECTRA mode, heat shock protein. So a lot of molecular mechanisms worked out as how this longer pulse YAG works. Now focus on the glabellar area pores. Notice the sebaceous thickened skin and large pores. That really bothered this woman. Very disturbed by it. She said she always was very self-conscious of her pores, and here you see after 3 treatments. Absolutely thrilled. In general, her skin looks much more refined with smaller pores, less blotchy red. So very nice cosmetic results. Here again, you see this sort of edematous or thickened sebaceous skin right here, large pores, more prominent upper nasolabial fold because of the junction of this thickened sebaceous skin here. Notice the vertical rhytids on the upper lip, which are very easy to treat, correct? I'm sure the audience would agree with that. Anything short of a SPECTRA or fractional ECO2, they're tough to treat. But look at the improvement in the refinement in her skin, much less glossy red. Pores are smaller, skin is much softer and more refined looking. Very, very happy patient. Here she is again, and notice the chin fold right here. Notice the improvement in the chin fold after 3 treatments. This was a very, very pleased patient. You can sort of imagine the firming and tightening. 65-year-old, now supposedly we can't treat 65-year-olds with sebaceous oily skin and large pores. They're not supposed to have that, but biochemically, androgen synthesis continues sometimes into the 80s with no opposing estrogen. So you do see elderly patients with thickened sebaceous skin and pores. Here's what we see after SPECTRA peels. Very thickened, rough, coarse-looking skin. She was just very upset. She said her nose looked, sort of thickened and bulbous, all over pores, this thick, oily skin. She really hated her skin. Here you see a total turnaround in the texture and tone and quality of her skin. And look at the nose. There's now much more definition in the bulbar area. So a simple procedure. The orbital rhytids are better. Her chin area looks better. Notice the blotchy pigment here, the blotchy brown pigment, significantly lessened after just a few treatments. And of course, the longer you go, the better it gets. You can keep doing SPECTRA peels. There's no limit. You do them in maintenance also. 65-year-old again, show you more example of very sebaceous, thickened skin, prominent horizontal forehead lines. Look at the improvement, the redness, color, texture, tone. Beautiful. Just a very nice result. Again, a close-up showing blotchy redness, some solar lentigines right here that you see, some sebaceous hyperplasia, hyperplastic lesions, large patulous pores, prominent at the nasolabial folds, now significantly better. Texture, tone, color, texture, tone, color. These patients love their skin. Here's just some other clinicals from Lutronic. Tattoo removal. Shows you that it can remove tattoos. We know that for sure. Tattoo removal. Melasma. And this we'll talk about a little further, but very, very nice result in melasma. Is it cured? I'm sure it's not, but it's treatable. Post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation, probably post-traumatic. Very nice result in PIH. Active acne and active acne scarring, these red pits again. It's gotten rid of most of this active and massive inflammatory tissue. Neva Savota, beautiful result with Neva Savota. And notice, no textural changes. That's the key. There are absolutely no changes. Remember the flat top beam we showed you in laser physics. It all comes into play. The failure to have pulse drift. Those pulses are all laid down in equal fluence to tissue. This is just showing one of our staff with a proper way to apply the carbon lotion that is put on the skin prior to using the two modes from the Lutronic Spectra laser. We like to use the Clarisonic brush first to thoroughly clean the pores, allow for much better penetration of the carbon lotion. We allow it to soak in for 15 to 20 minutes, and we get a very homogeneous application. That's critical to the success of the procedure. This just shows you the treatment protocol. We wrote it down. It will be archived. I don't think we have to go through it specifically, but you can see what it talks about this. It shows the fluences we use. You can do treatments monthly times 3 and then a maintenance schedule every 3 months for these spectral laser peels. This is our own protocol. And acne is very similar. The published paper from Korea shows they tended to use some higher fluences in the Asian patients published in the study. I think it's a little tougher to get our patients to tolerate the higher fluences in the U.S. For a few reasons. They don't want any pinpoint petechiae or purpura, and they're just wimps compared to the Asian patients, unfortunately. They just don't tolerate it. But these were the parameters. Just using hair removal, we're going to skip that. This shows, this is just a pro forma. And you always want to know, will anybody really tell you if the laser is working in their practice? And the answer is no. But I just show this. I'm happy to share this with you folks. Minus the lease and the overhead for cost of supplies, staffing, everything, we still brought in about 9 months, a substantial net profit, net gain. Now you see there's a decline here in the acne pills. That's because we lazed our wave of acne patients, and now they're mostly going to steady state maintenance, that type of thing. There's a little drop off here over the summer, which we see every summer in skin rejuvenation procedures, but very impressive. Market. How do you market the Spectra? It is important to market it. It really has an impact. There is name recognition with this device. So of course it's on our website, which links to our Facebook site, which is very important. We do e-blasts and do promos with it. Our newsletter, which unfortunately doesn't come out as often as I'd like to, but in these bad economic times, you need to have these coming out very frequently. We have the device archived on our YouTube channel, Facebook, word of mouth. Of course, the word of mouth spreads rapidly about this laser. People love it. Brochures in the waiting room, and then articles about the device, and a PR wire release that you see here. PR web release is a very, very effective way of announcing a new laser in your practice. Very cost-efficient way of doing it. And sometimes within an hour, you'll have 6,000 to 10,000 hits. This company puts research behind their lasers, and that is impressive. On pigment, 9 peer-reviewed journal articles, 2 white papers. Skin rejuvenation, 3 peer-reviewed articles. Acne, 2, and 1 in the JAD, recent JAD issue. And then 2 other reviewed articles in keloids and hypertrophic scars in the treatment of argyria. So it's very nice to see them willing to spend the money on R&D and get these publications done. So clinical validation, I'm sorry, let me go back. Clinical validation, this is a fascinating paper, Basic Science, and it shows that you can basically target the melanosomes and pigment in the melanocytes of the pigmented zebrafish without injuring the melanocyte. And remember, we told you about thermal confinement to the target. And what's critical about that is pulse duration, short pulse. If you try to do that with another laser and you get pulse drift, that's it. You will get loss of thermal confinement and damage to the structure and cell itself. So they've coined the term subcellular selective photothermolysis. I really like this term, of melanin pigment achieved in the zebrafish model with almost total pigment removal effluent of 0.4 joules with no damage to the cell itself, and the cells completely recover in a few months. What really happens after this is you see the laser does a dendritectomy, and you see downregulation of FAR2 and some of the molecular cytokines indicative of active melanin transfer. So it just knocks down the dendrites. They basically are gone, and the melanocyte just sits there resting. So again, low fluences for the treatment of melasma, especially in Asian type 3-4 skin, by targeting melanin granules and melanosomes, and because of the thermal confinement, no PIH. Very, very nice. Here's a study showing again that in the zebrafish on electron microscopy, and these are, normally we don't have time to read these articles, but this one is so relevant. This is a really cool slide showing the dendritic processes before laser toning. And as you folks know, these melanocytes make pigment, and they transfer it through these dendritic processes to keratinocytes. And here, after laser toning, you see them almost senescent with their dendrites pulled in and just chilling, taking it easy. And again, subcellular photothermolysis. Really, really interesting stuff. Here is the paper in laser therapy on dual toning using low fluence photothermal quasi-long pulse YAG followed by low energy Q switch, about 1.2 joules. So the dual toning for melasma achieves lightening and rejuvenation of the skin and treat other concomitant skin disorders. It's well tolerated with repeat treatments. Minimal downtime. We can improve good results with adjunctive topical or even LED therapy like the new Heal Light from Lutronic. So there are ways to even improve the already good results. 67% response in melasma to this therapy. So now that we've been through the key slides, I'll turn this over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasily. It was a fantastic presentation. At this time, I would like any of the physicians in the or any of the attendees to please send in some questions. I have one question here. Can you tell me the ideal power settings for removal of freckles and the number of sessions required?
Well, there are none, and let me clarify that for you. I don't think that you can remove freckles permanently. You can knock them down and make them better, but they are incredible. They'll, what I like to tell the people about Aphelid's True Freckles is we'll be back. So, again, I think it depends. There's no one setting. You have to look at the color of the freckle. If it's light brown, then of course you may need a slightly higher fluence. You want to match the spot size to the lesion size, but again, a slightly larger spot is better because there's less side scatter. But you can, depending on darker pigmented lesions, you really have to dial it in and look for some light frosting, and that's what I would emphasize. You want to see the end point clinical endpoint varies, but you want a nice light frost, and that'll be followed in about 10 days by light desquamation and a pink base that will fade quickly. You don't want to overtreat and stimulate PIH. One of the clinical pearls in treating ephelides or freckles, or for that matter, pigmented lesions, take a history from the patient, ask them if they have red hair highlights or a family history of red hair, because if they do, that means that they may be more pheomelanin dominant. And pheomelanin does not absorb 532 light as well. So you may have to overcome that by using a slightly higher fluence. And that's what we do. So we look at the color of the ephelides or freckles or brown spots. We may do a few little test pulses to create that light frosting. And that's the desired clinical endpoint.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on the tattoo market and the growth potential for a practice to offer these treatments?
Well, it's a tough question, Brian, because, of course, a lot depends on the world around us, but I think there's no question that the marketplace will grow. I think the key thing that we see with tattoo patients is they want value for their dollar. They don't want to do 15 to 20 treatments and then have to treat the hypopigmentation with fractional lasers and the scarring and scar revision, and that's a huge issue. We tend to probably treat tattoos at a slightly lower price point and do volume, and I think we do very well doing that. So that word will spread very quickly, and again, I think a lot of it depends on how you interact and market. On the web, I think marketing yourself to tattoo artists, they'll oftentimes bring their family in and you can treat them. If they have one or two that they want removed or covered, you can treat them gratis to show them your laser, your knowledge. It goes a long way. So even in these troubled times that we're in, we still see many, many new tattoo patients. The key thing that we're seeing today, two things. One is, of course, patients wanting the divorcee name removed from their tat. We've done that. We've seen some, occasional, not so much true gang-related tattoos, but just tattoos that really can't be shown in the workplace. And we see that more and more. For example, the state police, the Marine Corps, they're very strict about, and in fact, more strict than ever about recruits coming in with visible tattoos in their arms or below their collar line. So I think there will be a growing market, and I think when we see some rebound, hopefully in the economy over the coming years, I think the potential market is absolutely huge. We have to be up to the task. We've got to be able to treat these patients very effectively. They've got to see interval progress, and I think that's what I showed you in those pictures of my patients with the Lutronic device.
Here's another good question. How do you price the different treatments? And they also want to know where they can get copies of the protocols.
Well, most of the protocols will be archived on the website, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I would tell you too, by the way, the training manual that comes with the Lutronic has very, very nice protocols. Likewise with the ECO2, it's very laid out very nicely. So the protocols are in there. If you're referring to our own protocols, we certainly would be happy to talk with your office staff specifically and go over things with them. We've had many patients visit our office, watch us do procedures, and we're happy to do that. I think there'll be enough archived on here. I will tell you that this is another strong feature of Lutronic. Their clinical trainers are superb. It was one of the most interesting training sessions that I've witnessed. Really, really remarkable training session on Echo 2 and 1064. So they're very knowledgeable and will help you, but we certainly can help you if you're stuck or have any questions or difficult cases. It's really what we like to do.
Okay, the next question is, what is the ideal power settings for melasma in skin type 4?
Well, skin type 4, I think you want to go, I tend to err on the very light side. The clinical endpoint is the key. You want to create a light pink or light erythema at the endpoint. So, in the Q switch mode, it's critical that you really want to keep the fluences, I think, down, and we'll even start under 1 joule in those folks, because with the Q switch mode, I think it's important because to minimize the risk of rebound PIH. I've not seen that to date, but you might use, I would say, for example, you might start slow in the long pulse mode or quasi-long pulse mode, 300 microsecond mode with 5 joules, 5 millimeter handpiece. And I would say probably 1 joule or even 0.8 in darker skin types. That combo is where I would probably start to be safe. You can always go up very, very gradually. Remember, you really don't need to go up as high as one might think, because remember the melanocytes we showed you, because of the targeting and the flat top beam, you get a lot of tissue effect. And of course, in darker patients, you just don't need as much fluence to get the desired tissue effect. So that probably is where I would start, probably at about 0.8 joules per centimeter squared with the 8 millimeter collimated handpiece, and then probably about 5 joules per centimeter squared with the photothermal mode.
Another question is, they're asking about the dye handpieces. Do you have the kind of background on the dye handpieces? Could you explain the dye handpieces to this requester?
Sure, Brian. I mean, I've used them before with other companies' lasers. I can tell you that I was amazed to see the improvement in the engineering and the design in them. The number of pulses available with the dye-impregnated handpieces is just enormous. I mean, you literally can use them for years. You basically have a 2 millimeter spot. The rep rate differs with the two different dye-impregnated handpieces at 585 and 650. 585, for example, you might treat sky blues. That's really what I would use it for, like the tattoo I showed you. And again, what you do is you walk up the fluence so that you see a nice frosting, just a light frosting. You don't want to overlap pulses. You don't want to create a lot of dense white frosting in colors, just like you would do with any other Q-switch laser or KTP. The 650 laser more or less simulates the ruby. So, for example, for greens or some of the darker teals, I'll use the 650 dyed handpiece. Now, when they screw onto your 532 handpiece, which is how it works, and then the 532 is pumped through the dye-impregnated polymers, of course, the wavelength is changed to the desired wavelength. And that automatically shows on your SPECTRA laser screen the handpiece that you're using, the spot size. So again, it eliminates any risk of error, hertz, that type of thing. So that's sort of how they work. I've just started to use the dye-impregnated handpieces recently, but they're just remarkable. They're really fun to use, and I already am thinking of other applications for them. For example, probably for some brown spots and small keratoses and little brown polypoid keratoses on the neck with that small spot. So already thinking of other applications. They're really nice to use.
Here's another question. Can the SPECTRA treat keloid or hypertrophic scars? Do you mind going back to the slide with the scars that you showed and just kind of quickly go over it one more time?
Yes, Steph, do you know let's see what slide that is, so we could, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have the pull downs here on the screen. Let's see. In terms of treating scars with Q-switch lasers or YAG lasers, if you go back into the literature, it turns out there's actually quite a bit of literature on treating keloids and hypertrophic scars, either with long pulse YAG lasers. So, as I mentioned to you, there are alterations in molecular cytokines and transforming growth factor beta. So, certainly using the Q-switch laser, which photoacoustically disrupts some of that keloidal collagen, is effective. And again, in treating them, you're using lower fluences, 1.8 to 2.2 joules. 7 millimeter spot, 5 to 6 passes over them with some overlap. That's how we treat them, but we treat a lot of hypertrophic scars more and more with QS-YAG and also the quasi-long pulse mode I really like. So there are publications and peer-reviewed publications from Lutronic on using efficacy, safety of 1064 Q-switched YAG, low fluence treatment for keloids and hypertrophic scars. So there are papers published on this in the Journal of the European Academy of Derm and Venereology. Very, very nice papers, impressive pictures. But it's become really one of my go-to lasers for red, tender hypertrophic scars. And many times what you see is after the first treatment of doing multiple passes with the QS-YAG, some of these exquisitely tender hypertrophic scars, pain, pruritus, just tenderness with light touch, feel dramatically better after one treatment. And then you'll start to see them flatten out. And again, you can couple that, your treatment with the YAG with, you can use some silicone sheeting, you can use some intralesional steroid. I like to use a product called Oleva, O-L-E-V-A, made by Cylon Technologies, which I'm sure any of you who do resurfacing are familiar with that membrane. It's a polymer, and I like to inject tough hypertrophic scars and use membranes as well on some of the difficult ones. With that combo, we've had really, really nice results.
So following up on that, is there a better time to treat keloid stars, like when they're young or as they get older? Is there the best time to use it?
Well, the literature varies on this, Brian, and surgeons, plastic surgeons are horrified if you suggest treating one of their new scars. So let it mature, let's see what it does, let it remodel. Well, we really have just the opposite approach. There have been a number of publications through the years presented at ASLMS on using, for example, the pulse dye laser. I think Dr. Allen has presented some of them on using the PDL immediately after suture removal and showing that you can really prevent a lot of the hash marks, the redness, and get a better cosmetic result on split or scars that have split treatment, untreated and treated. So the precedent is there for treating scars early on, and we've really extended that in the research I've done with fractional lasers and scar resurfacing through the years. It's been a real focus of my own research. This is my own opinion. I think the earlier you can treat the scar, the better. My dermatology practice has a large Mohs surgery practice, and I routinely treat the Mohs scars immediately on suture removal with the pulse dye laser. And if there are some subcuticular sutures, some vicryls, I will wait about 4 to 6 weeks for those vicryls to dissolve because I don't want to disrupt those with an ablative or non-ablative fractional laser. So I think, it somewhat depends on the scars. We've actually done a lot of research looking at even pre-treating skin prior to wounding. So this is an area, this is a topic of research. I think my own impression is it's much easier to treat certainly scars that are less than 6 months old, burn scars. When you start getting scars that are older and you biopsy them and you see that dense interlocked collagen that's almost really acellular, you're really up against it. It's tough to remodel them. There's not a lot of target to shoot at. I think you can volumetrically reduce them with the erbium laser or the fractional ECO2, depending on what you're trying to do. What I tend to do now, by the way, just to digress, I do a lot of fractional CO2 laser resurfacing of grafts. Because, for example, on a nose, I just did 2 today. You'll see that ring of bound down ring where the suture line is. And I like to use the little spot size of the Echo 2 just to treat the ring. You can virtually eliminate that depressed V-shaped area where the sutures were and blend, full thickness grafts into the skin. So again, I like to treat our post-surgical scars as soon as the vicryl are dissolved, and I like to treat them immediately on suture removal within the first week with with the pulse dye laser. So and then if they develop any sign of hypertrophic scarring at all, I like to again treat them early on. Like this is a fairly early scar that we treated in this picture. but it was obvious to us that it was forming hypertrophic scars. So again, I think you get better results the earlier you treat them.
And the next question is, they're asking about the 532 wavelength. Are there chances of PIH when treating freckles with the 532? And what do you do to prevent PIH in general?
That's a great question. PIH, as you know, is an ongoing struggle, and I'll tell you, I think where we get into trouble, and the cases that I see at my laser center referred to me particularly by derms, usually what happens is they'll see a patient with freckling and treat them with an IPL. And what happens is, a green light green filtered IPL, these patients, because of the photothermal effect, will get rebound PIH. Now, if you look at these patients, I've really come to realize this since we've used the Vizia 6 imaging system. If you really study these folks, what you'll see is an admixture of speckled melasma-like pigment and lentiginous and aphylides. And there's no way to know when you treat these folks. I think you almost have to image them first and really question them about pigmentation postpartum, problems with pigmentation in the past, hyperpigmentation and scars. Because if they are PIH formers and they've had melasma, then you can almost bet they're going to develop PIH after KTP. Does it help to pre-treat them with bleaching creams? I don't know. I've just never had success with that. Personally, what I tend to do with these folks, if I know that there's a risk, is I'll lase them less aggressively and over-treat them. Because if you use too high effluents, that's why clinical judgment and endpoints are important. If you over-treat them, and especially if you create purpura, you're probably going to get PIH. So you want to get that nice endpoint of just light frosting. That's all you need. And if there's a risk of PIH, what I do is I start them on a topical steroid ointment 24 hours post-op. The day after, immediately after the treatment, I ice them very, very well and use clobetasol 2 times that day and continue icing. The next day, we start immediately a mid-potency fluorinated steroid on the face for 2 weeks to the spots, like fluocinolone ointment or fluticasone. Either one is okay. And that has seemed to reduce the incidence very nicely. And I make sure I get them back at 2 weeks, because then at 2 weeks, if we see any trace of PIH, we'll start them on a bleaching agent. And the one that I like for PIH early on is azelaic acid in cream form. And of course, sunscreens. I think that's our best approach. But to answer the question, yes, you can see it. I think the key thing is patient selection, optimizing patient parameters after you've taken a history of PIH after procedures. Of course, if they're olive skin patients and, females with a history of melasma.
The next question is, do you treat fresh tattoos? And how soon after a tattoo has been put on somebody's skin would you treat it?
Once the injury is healed, epidermal injury, I like to treat them personally very early on, before the material has a chance to be engulfed. Not sure what happened there. Before it has a chance to be engulfed by macrophages, and there's an inflammatory infiltrate. I've had patients come to me who've had mistakes made on tattoos, and I've treated them within a week or 2 after application, and they do beautifully. They do very, very nicely. We're just a little more gentle with the treatment. We don't need to be quite as aggressive. And they do very, very well, as long as, again, you use very good post-op and make sure that the epidermis, that they're healed after placement early on. But I've treated them very early on. Sooner, I think, again, the sooner the better.
How do you treat scar red tattoos?
Scar. In other words, just to clarify, in other words, a tattoo that is it has red colors with scarring in the red. Is that
I
just a,
believe that's what he means.
yeah? Well, they're tough because again you're treating both the scar and the ink. So what I'll but we know that low energy QS-YAG lasers can work on scarring, and so I tend to treat them both at the same time to try to reduce the hypertrophic scarring. I might inject them with some steroid after using a Q-switch YAG for the scar, and then just use a very lower energy initially KTP wavelength Q-switch KTP to treat the red ink per se. You can also use ablative lasers on tattoos that are scarred to treat both the scarring. I'll oftentimes use a non-thermal ablative laser initially to treat some hypertrophic scars. You can use an erbium laser. You can use fractional CO2 also to work on scars. So, again, I think the idea is to treat both the scar and the ink, but we certainly have results. I don't know if the person asking the question means if the patient's having a reaction to red ink. That's a different challenge. Those folks I tend to treat with some topical steroids with occlusion to cool them down for a week or two, and then usually we'll treat them with not with Q-switch lasers. We'll treat them with other modalities.
Did you have a melasma slide up there where you talked about how you treat melasma?
Yeah, there was. It wasn't my slide. It was one of the company slides. But certainly the protocol is out there and published using frequent treatments with low fluence Q-switch YAG lasers for melasma, and the new dual toning method that they've got FDA approval for that method. But you can use that dual toning method to treat melasma. It basically involves utilizing lower energy long pulsed quasi long pulse settings as well as lower energy Q-switch YAG settings, and just doing on a repetitive treatment cycle, like for example every other week until you see improvement. It could take 4, 6, 8 treatments, and you can certainly combine that with the use of bleaching creams. There's a suggestion that you can even enhance the results by doing the treatment followed by chemical peel and use of bleaching agents. So there's a lot of ways to optimize the results with the device so that you're not relying just solely on the device. I think the answer is how do you treat melasma? I think with whatever works for the patient. And there are just some patients who, no matter what you do, they will have rebounded pigmentation. And it's been reported with virtually every device, IPLs, Q-switch lasers, thulium lasers. It's just the nature of melasma. But I think this protocol looks like a really good management protocol, and we've had some real nice success with it early going.
The next question is about using a tattoo laser and causing scarring. So how often do you see a tattoo laser actually cause scarring? And why would it do such a thing?
Well, there's no question. You definitely can see scarring, and for those of us who've treated tattoos for 15, now almost 20 years, we see a lot of patients referred to us who have been treated in the early days when there were very Gaussian beamed Nd:YAG, Q-switch Nd:YAG lasers used, some Q-switch rubies that resulted in some really prolonged or in effect permanent hypopigmentation. So we know that Q-switch lasers can cause scarring, both by creating an epidermal injury and dermal injury. And I think the key in this, again, if you go back to the physics of this device, I think first of all your parameters are very safely connected between handpiece and screen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that flat top beam really enhances the safety profile of the Lutronic Spectra as opposed to other QS-YAGs. If you are not real experienced in using a YAG, you've got to start slowly. If you are firing at 10 hertz, you better be real good at the hand speed and not get a lot of pulse stacking or overlapping, especially early on when you're treating them, because if you create epidermal injury, blistering, which is dermal epidermal junction, and some dermal injury, papillary dermal injury, and you don't heal them properly, they're going to scar and hypopigment. So I think the post-op care is critical in these folks. I insist that they come back in 2 weeks and that they call and report any blistering to us. It's not unusual to get blistering with tattoo laser treatments, but I don't like to see blistering with the YAG. The Q-switch ruby, they seem to heal regardless, but when they call back your office, that at least gives you the opportunity to interact with them and reinforce the written and verbal post-op protocol of how to take care of any blisters. And I like to see them back in a few weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, to make sure they've healed properly. Because if they've not healed properly, and I do see some incipient scarring, either maybe they scratched it, they didn't take care of it post-op, we immediately intervene with some fractional lasers, oftentimes fractional non-ablative lasers, and you can immediately reverse the problem without issue and prevent any pigmentary changes. So again, it's a combination of optimized parameters, not over-treating. You know, there's a tendency amongst, I see this mistake all the time, you know, the ink's not totally gone, so let's just keep using smaller spot sizes because there's a lot more energy. As you know, you get more side scatter. It's much harder to handle and control that beam. And, you know, that's the source of a lot of scarring. So those are some clinical pearls.
Another question is, as your tattoo fades with progressive treatments, do you incrementally increase your fluence?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you've definitely got interval fading, and we like to take pictures every time, you know, for example, if you're doing an R20, you'll see even on the second pass that you'll have to use a slightly higher fluence because there's less target. So typically you do, and you just want to tweak the energies up a little bit each time, yes.
Is there a minimum time gap for using the spectrum or spectra for melasma? Is there any, you know, when you're doing treatment 1, treatment 2, the time difference?
Yeah, I certainly would not treat more often than 2 weeks. That's the protocol that was in the published article, was 2 weeks.
When you're treating multicolor tattoos, which is the first wavelength that you treat with?
I typically will try to reduce the intensity of the black ink and go after the black ink first to unload it, because a lot of times you'll see that the colors will be much more visible and isolated after that, and so it allows for more accurate placing of the 532, 585, or 650 pulses.
I think this is a question from, I believe, somebody who's not a current user. Is your staff happy performing the procedure? And what they're asking about is, do they complain about how long the treatment takes or the comfort of their clients?
Not at all. As I mentioned early on, the ergonomics of this device are phenomenal for the user, and that is critical. It's one of the nicest hand pieces to use, so there's no operator fatigue. We don't see any repetitive strain injuries. No, they're very, very pleased with it. It's one of their favorite lasers to use, frankly. And again, that is the hallmark of Lutronic devices. They're just reliable. They don't break down. They're sort of like a Maytag, used to be anyway. They don't break down. They're reliable. The interfaces are just amazing, and so they're very easy for staff to use, and most importantly, it's hard to make a mistake, and that's the key.
We have another question about the Spectra peel and what are your most common protocols. Did you have a slide on that? Was it
I,
the next slide,
I
just?
did, I did, Brian. Yes, there was a slide showing our typical protocol, and so it's in there. But again, the idea is to you want the carbon particles to get into the skin very nicely. And if you folks have ever, just a little, again, a clinical pearl, if you're lasing women with brown spots, pigment on their face, and you're treating lentigines, if you notice that snap and almost an explosive sound that you hear early on when you fire that QS-YAG, unless you've cleaned their makeup thoroughly, and therein is the problem. How do you clean makeup out of pores? There was a paper published about 5 years ago that showed that after a woman has makeup on for about 6 hours or so, even sooner, it migrates into the follicular ostia of the sebaceous follicles, and it's there. And if you look at makeups, what do they have in them? Silica, titanium, all these particles. So when you laze, you try to laze through a female's makeup, you'll hear this snap, you'll see smoke. It's really fascinating. So this clarisonic device I use routinely before we treat. If a woman has makeup on and we're going to be doing Q-switched 532 laser on brown spots on her face, we clean her very, very carefully. If she has any makeup on with a clarisonic, we get much better, even lasing, better tissue effect. So yeah, that's the protocol. We first clean and get those carbon particles in the skin. We start with, here's our protocol, using the 8mm spot, 1 to 5, 2.5 joules per centimeter square, 1 to 2 passes, minimal overlap. And again, skin type 4 use 1 joule, a little less. And when you do this, you'll notice when you fire the Q switch mode, it's really fun. It's like a video game. It reminds you of Pac-Man because you'll just see the carbon particles vaporized in the pattern. They're really great. But as I said, it is my favorite, personally my favorite treatment to have. You get both a photothermal and a photomechanical effect from the treatments.
The next question is about, what about doing incremental fluence increase? What about doing the incremental fluence increase on tattoos in your Fitzpatrick 4 and 5 patients? And then then it goes on, to avoid hyperpigmentation, do you have to decrease the fluence as there is less tattoo pigment visible?
No, I mean when you're treating patients of that skin color, I'm just treating a patient now who literally has a tribal tattoo over his entire abdomen. He's a type 6 skin, blue-black skin. It's really remarkable to see. And of course, what I'll do in that case is start at lower fluences with a 1064 YAG, Q-switch YAG, and do test spots to make sure that the tissue can handle it. Now, remarkably, with this device, I've been amazed at the tissue tolerance in type 5-6 skin for the Q-switched 1064 mode is truly been amazing. They've tolerated much higher energies than I thought that I've ever seen tolerated before with any other QS-YAG. So I think given that flat top beam, you certainly can treat them at reasonable fluences. If there are islands of ink that are just not clearing and resistant, most likely there's a problem with the needling itself. In some patients with darker skin, when that ink was applied, they probably developed some scarring and fibrosis around the islands of ink that are left, and that's a really difficult issue. You give it time, you might just retreat at the same fluence, but to keep going up in fluence over them doesn't always help, and in fact, it can lead to scarring. So you've got to figure out what's going on in those islands. If there is some associated fibrosis from the initial tattoo needling placement, then I most likely would treat those with, for example, a fractional erbium laser rather than a Q-switch laser.
When you have whitening or bleaching of the skin after tattoo removal, will the skin come back eventually? Will the color in the skin come back eventually?
Um, it's a tough question. The answer is you sure hope so. I would, you start on the front end by making sure you tell patients and show them pictures, and I do this routinely, of what we mean by loss of pigment and hypopigmentation, and let them know it can be permanent. It's a risk. And it can be technique related, and it can just happen. Anyone who tells you they've treated tattoos, thousands of tattoos, and hasn't had it happen is lying, because it's a fact of life that we live with. So you've got to warn the patient, medical legally. You've got to tell them what could happen, that it may never repigment. But let's say that it does. With a Q-switched ruby, it's much more likely to repigment. Little less so than with a QS Alex. And if you get hypo that's lasting more than 3 months with a QS YAG, it might come back somewhat, but you've got a problem. And so I usually don't wait that long. I typically will intervene and try to repigment those patients. And again, minimizing the epidermal injury by great post-op care can mitigate a lot of that hypopigmentation complication. We've used fractional non-ablatives to repigment people very efficiently. You can, in some cases, I've used a combination of that and the excimer laser. So you can repigment them. It's not hopeless. But certainly if you've got a light-skinned patient, especially whose melanocytes are not real, not real functional to begin with, they're really the ones at risk. And if you have a darker-skinned patient, then at least there's a reservoir of melanocytes that can hopefully repigment that area. But it is a tough problem, and it's a worrisome problem. There are, probably see every few years, a lawsuit or two referred to me where the patient developed hypopigmentation. And of course, the worst is, I just saw a case not long ago. The tattoo was treated with an IPL. And just whatever I can tell you, do not. It's still done. It's hard to believe, but it's still done. So, when a wrong device is used, that's when you really see some serious issues.
Have you ever seen hypopigmentation when treating melasma?
Yeah, and yeah, the answer to that is yes, but I would tell you that I have created gut-taped speckled hypopigmentation in a few patients just using repeated episodes of laser toning. Now, when that happened, we didn't know that that could happen. It was a shock. I think we saw one of the first cases and thought, uh-oh, what's going on? Why is this happening? Well, with laser toning early on in the late 90s, it was not uncommon to do multiple treatments, sometimes 20, 30, 40, just because patients looked great. They saw some skin rejuvenation, tightening, their beards were lighter. But we noticed in some of the darker patients, Indian patients in particular were prone to it. Some African American patients developed this gut-tape hypopigmentation that, on biopsy, you actually do see some upper dermal fibrosis. So, it was a scary thing to see. And actually, a colleague of mine, an outstanding derm laser surgeon, had probably one of the first cases reported, an Indian patient who developed the speckled hypopigmentation, referred the patient to me for treatment, and fortunately we were able to repigment that patient with repeated non-ablative lasers. But it's scary, and it can happen. Now, I think, in the laser toning, we used to think that more was better, and we used higher fluences, and we stacked pulses, a lot of pulses at 10 hertz. It was just too much. It was like the theory that, well, more's got to be better. So we now know with melasma, and we're treating melasma, as I mentioned, we're using very low energies to treat it, and not that aggressive pulse stacking, and being very, very careful just to create light pinkness. So I think a lot of that was technique and number of treatment related. Don't forget, again, many of those earlier QS YAGs had a very Gaussian beam, so we were getting some real hot spots in the dermal collagen when we treated patients with laser toning.
The next question is, have you found patients you have tried chemical peels or IPL treatments on that have been good candidates for the SPECTRA peel?
For melasma, Brian?
It doesn't specify actually.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the results, what you feel after Spectra is very different, though, and I would quantify that, is very different feeling qualitatively than a chemical peel, either glycolic, TCA, or whatever. Microdermabrasion, it's uniquely different. There is, your skin feels very tight for a few weeks because it's been shown that quasi-long pulse 300 microsecond mode creates little micro injuries in the upper dermis down to a few hundred microns. So you feel very tight and taut. Your pores are smaller. There is a noticeable reduction in the thickened, oily skin, oil production, pore size. You're much less blotchy red. So it really is I think of it by itself as probably the next, minimally invasive treatment to follow something like a hydrofacial or chemical peel or something like that. It's definitely, there's more bang for the buck, no question, from those Spectra peels because you are getting that laser toning effect, so to speak, from the quasi-long pulse and the QS YAG. And when you do a series of them, it's really remarkable. We've now seen patients who've just had remarkable reduction in pore size. I don't know of any other chemical peel or any other treatment that's really going to do that on a prolonged basis.
The next question is, can you talk a little bit more about the R20?
Yeah, I'd love to. I just commented on this at length one of the blogs I was telling you about it at 4 a.m., so it was probably totally incoherent, but I'll try to make more sense of now. This R20, it's really fascinating to me because I'm still not totally convinced that what's not going on is if you treat a tat out of the box and you're good enough and confident enough with that laser and you fire at 10 hertz and you get a lot of pulse stacking right out of the gate, I'm not convinced that my results are that much better than doing that method. So when I do an R20, I looked at the papers and they talked in the papers about how there were no textural changes reported. But unless I was seeing wrong, I saw textural changes. They were clearly visible to me, and I wondered about this. So then at the most recent ASLMS meeting last year, Dr. Kilmer, who I have great respect for her knowledge and expertise, really showed in a very nicely done study that passes 3 and 4 were really not much more bang for the buck and significantly increased the rate of epidermal injury and result in textural and pigmentary changes. And that's exactly what I've seen. I think after 2 passes, there's diminishing returns. And from a practical point of view, at least what do you do with these people for that length of time in your office? It's not always the greatest blend of patients. If you get somebody in there with a sleeve who you're going to do an R20 on that takes an hour and you keep them there 20 minutes for another hour, and they're sitting there with an admixture of people coming in for Botox. It's a tough mix. I mean, there are all kinds of practical obstacles. Having said that, I think that we do see some enhanced results with that second pass, but I don't think it's in any way miraculous. Roy Geronimus presented, I'm certain it was Roy and his group from Manhattan, presented a very nice paper on accelerating the time or the treatment time for the second treatment by using an optical clearing agent. I believe it is called Predecolate. He showed some very nice results. So I'm not totally convinced by it, to be very honest with you. I think that if you're real good and you're very careful and you don't, I think doing both passes at 10 hertz, you are going to get epidermal damage. If you're not careful and you get a lot of pulse overlap, you're going to get a lot of purpura, blistering, And with that comes the risk of textural changes and pigmentary changes. So I think if you're doing it, you've got to go very, very carefully. And, know your laser. You certainly don't want to do it with a Gaussian beam laser. I've not had any issues, and I showed you pictures of tattoos treated with a modified R20 two-pass technique. I think, yes, it can be done. There's some benefit. I just somehow, I don't know, I'm not totally convinced, and I think that there's a significantly greater risk profile. I just had a call from a derm colleague the other day who used an R20 on a patient. You saw him back a month later, and the fellow has, I saw the patient for him, he has some significant areas of textural change, some early plaque-type scars, and some incipient hypertrophic scarring. So I would say this to you, be wary, be very, very careful.
So just to clarify, the R20 is you repeat the treatment after 20 minutes when the whiteness disappears.
Right.
And up to how many times you do it is twice, while others are doing up to 4. However, you're seeing things that you don't like, so you're only ending it at 2. Okay.
Yes, and that's what Dr. Kilmer's presentation emphasized, that you really increase the amount of gain. There's such diminishing returns in terms of ink reduction after 2 but there's a significant increase in risk of textural and pigmentary changes. You really have to weigh the risk versus benefit. I don't see it. I don't think it's worth it. I've gotten such great results just with the 2. I just don't see a need to push it and risk those changes. I mean, the last thing you want is to have a tattoo that has all the ink is removed, but you're left with a ghosted outline of hypopigmented scarring.
Okay, the next question is, how do you treat cafe au lait? Do you do an all-over toning, or do you do spot treatments, and do you have a particular fluence that you use?
Yeah, cafe au lait macules, before I treat them, I pray, because they have a mind of their own. And if you read the literature on cafe au laits, there's some dermal factor that allows them to repigment. There's a significant incidence of PIH. So what I've learned from years of reading the literature on cafe au laits, my own treatments, you do not want to over-treat these because they very, very commonly will develop post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. So the protocol I use is I bring the patients in, use the 532, or sometimes I'll use a Ruby, or in this case you could use the 650. I think that the key is, again, the visible treatment endpoint. I can't give you a fluence because it depends on what fluence it takes to see that endpoint. I don't like a lot of overlap. You want to treat them to create a light frosting and let them desquamate. And again, I use the steroid post-op for 2 weeks and then a bleaching agent. The key thing in cafe au laits is not to treat them too frequently, because if they develop some PIH, you have to let that settle down before going back. So I won't usually treat them for at least 2 to 3 months and just see. And typically you'll see them hyperpigment a little bit after the treatment and then gradually fade. Again, the response rate is about 50-50 in terms of any type of prolonged remission. They're not great responders, and I've treated them with a variety of QS YAGs. I've treated them with, rubies. They're tough. They're tough to treat. They want to be there. That's the key. They've got that dermal memory that brings them back. But they can be addressed. They can be treated as long as the patient does. The thing with cafe au laits, it's absolutely critical that the patient's expectations are realistic, that they know that 50% of the time they're going to recur, and that there's a very good chance that they'll look worse, at least for a while post-treatment.
The next question is, have you had any success treating burn patients with the NDAG? If so, what methods are you using?
We've had some success. My experience with the NDAG in burn patients is limited, but the few that I have treated, I basically use the parameters that were reported in the peer-reviewed article from Lutronic on efficacy and safety of treating Q-switched for treating keloid hypertrophic scars. I've used those same parameters, and that is 1.8 to 2.2 joules per centimeter squared, 7-spot, and do 5 to 6 passes with some overlapping, and you know, assessing them. And usually you do see a significant reduction in height, in duration, and again, if they're symptomatic, they get significant symptomatic relief. So I've tended to follow that protocol, and I've treated them at 1 to 2 week intervals. Usually we'll know after the second or third treatment if this device is going to work.
Is there an optimal interval when you're treating tattoos?
Well,
Is it different for different skin types?
I think so, Brian. And again, this has changed. This has evolved over time. I mean, I remember distinctly many, many years ago with my first Q-switch laser, we treated at 4-week intervals, which was crazy. And you'd have a patient who had 15 to 18 treatments. But what really brought this home to me is we ended up treating some patients who, after one treatment, they just didn't come back because either it was expensive, it was situational, they moved, it was too painful, whatever reason. The classic one I remember was a young woman who had a tattoo, a black ink tattoo, heavily inked tattoo of Charlie Chaplin on her back, her entire back. Now, why she did that, I don't know. We never know. But we treated her one time, and she said, "I'm never doing this again." And I didn't see her back for 3 years when she came back to have something else treated. And she showed me the tattoo on her back. I said, "By the way, how is your tattoo?" And she said, "Oh, that's almost gone." And sure enough, I would say it was about 85% gone with one treatment. So I tend to be a therapeutic nihilist in this case. I tend to treat less often. So the first time I treat, the second treatment I'll do at 6 weeks. After that, 3 months. I just don't see any advantage and much greater risk to treating more often than that. I think all you're really doing at that point is treating the patient's credit card. Hopefully that helps.
Yes. What is the optimal endpoint? Is it frosting or sub-C hemorrhage?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, this is what I would encourage anyone who's a first-time Q-switch laser user to make sure they visit and precept with someone who's experienced and can show them the right clinical endpoints. I don't like to see purpura for a number of reasons. Purpura typically means that you're using more energy than you need. You're trying to force the issue. I think you don't need purpura. Now with a KTP, you're going to have a little more, obviously, incident of purpura, but you really do not need it to get results for red ink or orange ink. With a Q-switch YAG, you certainly don't need to create purpura. And if you've pushed the QS YAG that hard that you're getting, purpura to that degree, you don't need it. When you're treating brown spots, you really don't need purpura. Again, the end point is a nice, even, light white frosting. And that's what they should leave it, not a dense white frosting, a nice, light white frosting. And not a barely visible frost that's gone in 15, 20 minutes after the steam bubbles disappear. You want them to have a fairly, low to moderate, even white frost. That's the endpoint. On tattoos, I think it's very similar. I think you want to see a nice frosting. When you use a Q-switched ruby, for example, you're going to see a lot more of this frosting change because it's not as penetrating. There's more uptake by the melanin chromophore. So I tend to modify using the QS ruby lasers. I use a much longer standoff on the handpiece and defocus the beam because my endpoint is light frosting, minimal frosting, and I get great results with it, just like with the other hand pieces. So again, you're always going for that sweet spot, that perfect clinical endpoint. And And that you just have to see and experience to understand what we're talking about. There are photos of it in some of the texts and articles that are out there.
Here's a question. It talks about using a Q switch to treat pigmented lesion when the dark spots actually went away, but then they came back. Do you have any idea what that is?
Happens all the time, Brian. The chances are they're one of two things. Either you inadvertently lazed brown spots that you thought were lentigines, but in fact they were part of speckled melasma, or in a hyperpigmentation prone patient, one who either has a clinical history of melasma or hyperpigmenting scars, one who has an ethnic background that makes them more susceptible. As certainly Asian skin is incredibly high risk. Some of the brown skin tones, Indian skin, Cubans, people who have a lot of mixed ethnicity. They have Indian, Hispanic, but the Asian skin is certainly the greatest challenge we face. And that's a typical one. Now, the reason I'm telling you that, I had a patient I treated about 2 years ago who's still not thrilled with me, because I treated a few brown spots in his face with the QS Ruby, and they came back, and they were worse. So I treated him again, and they got worse. And I used bleaching creams and whatever, and nothing worked, and they're still there. And he's not happy. And I told him, I said, I just can't understand this. Your skin is behaving like Asian skin. And he said, well, maybe that's because my grandmother's Chinese. And so don't discount medicine. Don't throw away all the medical training you've had through the years. Apply it to these patients. Think smart. Think out of the box. Ask them about ethnicity, about melasma during pregnancy, red hair, that type of thing. And just really look at them and make sure that they're not a wolf in sheep's clothing, a lentigines hidden in speckled melasma. That's where you're going to run into the problem. But even if you do get some PIH, you make sure people know that can happen. If you use the steroid post-op and then you start treating them with a bleaching agent as early as 2 weeks after, as soon as you detect any PIH, you should be okay. And just keep reassuring them.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Well, I think that's it for the questions. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Vasily, for sharing your expertise with us this night. I'd also like to thank all the audience out there for sending in some great questions. I appreciate everybody joining us this evening. If you want some more information on this, please go to www.ilovemyspectra.com or just give us an email at contact@lutronic.com. If you would like to watch this again, it's going to be at www.lutronic.com pages/webinars, or just go on to www.lutronic.com and then just look in the news and events section. I'd just like to say thank you again, and good evening, everybody. Have a good night.